6 of the greatest wonders ever built didn't just fall. They were erased. No ruins, no remains, just silence. So what happened to them? And why does the only one that survived reveal something deeply unsettling about everything we build today? What if everything we call eternal is already gone? Not damaged, not hidden, not waiting to be rediscovered. Gone. There was a time when the world was filled with things so vast, so ambitious, that people believed they could outlive empires, outlast generations, maybe even defy time itself. Towers that touched the sky, statues that blinded the horizon, gardens that seemed to float above the earth like something pulled out of a dream. And yet today, almost all of them have vanished. 6 of the 7 greatest wonders of the ancient world, masterpieces that once defined human achievement, have disappeared so completely that we're left with fragments, second-hand descriptions, and a lot of unanswered questions. And I can't shake this one thought. How does something so big just disappear? Not over millions of years, but within the memory of our own civilization. Welcome to Hidden Truth Videos. I've been thinking about this more than I probably should. At first, it was just curiosity. You know, one of those questions you stumble into late at night and can't quite let go of. But the deeper I went, the more unsettling it became. Because this isn't just about lost buildings, it's about something we all assume without ever questioning, that the greatest things we create will last. But what if that's not true? What if everything we build, no matter how advanced, how beautiful, how meaningful, exists on borrowed time? If you're into uncovering mysteries like this, go ahead and subscribe. It really helps support the channel, and it keeps this kind of deep exploration going. The more I looked into these ancient wonders, the more I realized something important. They didn't all disappear the same way. Some were destroyed in seconds, wiped out by forces no one could control. Others didn't fall at all, at least not at first. They were slowly dismantled, piece by piece, until nothing recognizable remained. And then, there are cases where the line between history and myth starts to blur, where we're not even sure if what we're searching for ever truly existed. That's when this stopped feeling like history and started feeling like a pattern of creation, pride, and inevitable collapse. And maybe what makes this even more disturbing is that none of these structures were ordinary. These weren't fragile experiments or unfinished ideas. They were the pinnacle of human capability at the time, built with incredible effort, resources, and belief. People didn't just build them, they trusted them to last. So what went wrong? Was it nature, war, human ego, neglect, or something deeper, something built into the very idea of permanence itself? I don't think this is just a story about the past. I think it's a warning we've already seen play out again and again, and the only way to understand it is to go back to the beginning, to look closely at how these wonders were created, and more importantly, how they died. If this is a story about how the greatest things collapse, then it makes sense to begin with something that once looked completely unbreakable. I keep picturing the shoreline of Rhodes, not as it is now, but as it must have been over 2,000 years ago. Ships approaching the harbor, sunlight reflecting off the water, and rising above everything else. A figure so large it didn't just dominate the landscape, it defined it. The Colossus of Rhodes wasn't built in a time of peace. It was born out of survival. After a brutal siege, when an invading army finally retreated and left behind massive war machines, the people of Rhodes did something unexpected. They didn't just celebrate. They transformed the tools of destruction into something symbolic. They sold the weapons and used the money to build a god. That decision alone says a lot about how people saw the world back then. Victory wasn't enough. It had to be immortalized. At first, the statue was meant to be impressive, but not impossible. Then, ambition took over. The height doubled, the scale expanded beyond anything practical, and I can't help but notice something here. It's a pattern we still repeat today. We push something just a little further without fully understanding the consequences of that decision. 12 years of construction, an internal skeleton of iron and stone, bronze plates hammered and fitted around a structure that kept growing higher and heavier with every phase. They built earth ramps around it as it rose, like constructing a mountain just to create something that could be seen from miles away. And when it was finished, it must have felt untouchable, a shining giant, a symbol of resilience, of triumph. But symbols don't make something indestructible. In 226 BC, the ground shifted, an earthquake, no warning, no negotiation, and just like that, the statue fractured at its weakest point, its legs. The very foundation that carried all that weight simply gave out. That image stays with me, not the statue standing tall, but the moment it failed. Because it wasn't destroyed by an enemy, it wasn't dismantled by time, it broke under its own design, and then something even stranger happened. No one rebuilt it. For centuries, the remains lay where they fell. People traveled just to see the ruins. Even broken, it was still powerful, still impressive. But eventually, admiration turned into practicality. The bronze was cut apart, loaded onto caravans and taken away. Not preserved, not honored, reused, melted down into something else. And that's when it hit me. Something doesn't have to vanish in a dramatic moment to be lost. Sometimes it disappears because it becomes useful, because someone looks at it and sees material instead of meaning. I thought the lighthouse of Alexandria might be different. If the Colossus represented ambition, the lighthouse felt like something more refined, purposeful, designed not just to impress, but to function. Built on the island of Pharos, it wasn't just a tower. It was guidance, a signal in the dark, a structure that actively saved lives by helping ships navigate safely into one of the busiest ports in the ancient world. And unlike the Colossus, it endured. For centuries, it stood while empires changed around it. Governments rose and fell, cultures shifted, but the lighthouse remained. That kind of longevity feels rare even now. It makes you think, maybe this one got it right. Maybe it found the balance between scale and stability. But that's not what happened. Because the lighthouse didn't fail all at once. It was weakened. First by earthquakes that damaged its upper levels. Then, by time itself, slowly eroding its structure. And at some point, human decisions made things worse. There are stories, maybe exaggerated, maybe not, of parts of the lighthouse being dismantled because someone believed there was treasure hidden beneath it. That idea unsettles me more than the earthquake. The thought that something so important, so functional could be partially destroyed because of a rumor, because of the possibility of hidden wealth. Eventually, nature finished what time had started. A series of powerful earthquakes in the 14th century reduced the structure to ruins. And then, just like the Colossus, it didn't simply disappear. It was absorbed. Its stones were taken, reused to build a fortress that still stands today. And I keep coming back to that word, absorbed, because it suggests something quieter than destruction. Not an ending, but a transformation. The lighthouse didn't vanish in a single moment of chaos. It was slowly undone, dismantled, reinterpreted, until one day, it was no longer what it had been. And maybe that's the pattern that's starting to emerge. These wonders didn't just fall. They were forgotten in stages, replaced, reused, rewritten, until the original meaning faded and all that remained was whatever came after. Which makes me wonder if disappearance isn't always about losing something completely. Sometimes it's about losing what it meant. And just when I thought Disappearance was about destruction or slow decay, I ran into something even more unsettling. The possibility that one of these wonders didn't disappear at all, because it may never have existed the way we imagine. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Even saying the name feels different from the others. The Colossus, the Lighthouse, those feel grounded, physical, anchored in reality. But this feels almost like a memory you're not sure is yours. The story goes like this. A king, Nebuchadnezzar II, builds an entire mountain of greenery in the middle of a dry, unforgiving landscape. Not for power, not for defense, but for love. His wife, far from her homeland, missed the forests, the cool air, the feeling of elevation. So he created it for her, a layered structure of terraces rising upward, filled with trees, flowers, and flowing water. From a distance, it must have looked impossible. Green life suspended above the ground, as if gravity had been quietly ignored. And what draws me in isn't just the image, it's the engineering behind it. Because if this was real, then it wasn't just beautiful. It was incredibly advanced. Water had to be lifted continuously from the Euphrates River to the highest levels. Systems of channels, possibly mechanical lifts, had to run constantly just to keep the vegetation alive. This wasn't a static structure. It was something that had to function every single day, and that detail changes everything for me. Because unlike stone or bronze, this kind of wonder couldn't survive neglect. The moment the system stopped, everything would begin to die. The trees would dry out, the soil would collapse, the entire illusion would unravel from the inside. But here's where it becomes difficult to hold on to anything with certainty. There are no clear records from Babylon itself describing these gardens. No inscriptions celebrating their construction. No physical remains that can be definitively identified. Everything we know comes from later sources, Greek historians writing centuries after the supposed existence of the gardens. And that leaves me with a question I can't ignore. What if they got it wrong, or not completely wrong, but reshaped the story? Combined fragments of different places, different structures, into something more legendary than factual. There's a theory that the gardens weren't in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, built by a different king, using a complex irrigation system that could actually support something like this. That would explain the absence of direct evidence in Babylon, but even that doesn't fully resolve the uncertainty. Because now we're not just asking where the gardens were, we're asking if they were ever what we think they were. And I find that strangely unsettling in a way that's different from the other wonders. Because with the Colossus or the Lighthouse, we know they existed. We can trace their rise and fall. We can point to what remains, even if it's only fragments. But here, we're dealing with something that exists almost entirely in description, in imagination, in inherited belief. So now I'm caught between two possibilities. Either the Hanging Gardens were real and disappeared so completely that not even a trace survived, or they were never quite real to begin with, and we've been remembering something that only ever existed in stories, and I'm not sure which one is harder to accept. Because if something that extraordinary can vanish without a trace, that's unsettling. But if something can be remembered for thousands of years without ever truly existing, that changes how I see history itself, not as a record of what was, but sometimes as a reflection of what people needed to believe. And if the gardens leave me questioning whether something ever existed, the next stories force me to confront something much more familiar and much harder to ignore. What happens when we are the ones who destroy what we once believed was sacred? I used to think that time or nature were the greatest threats to these wonders. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized something uncomfortable. In many cases, the final blow didn't come from earthquakes or erosion. It came from us. The Temple of Artemis is probably the clearest example of that. It wasn't just a temple. It was an entire world built around belief, wealth, and identity. Massive marble columns, carefully designed proportions, intricate artwork, everything about it was meant to inspire awe. People didn't just visit it, they experienced it. And then one night, all of that was set on fire. Not by an invading army, not during a war, by a single individual, a man named Herostratus, who wanted one thing: his name to be remembered. I keep thinking about that moment, about the silence before the flames, the decision, the intent behind it. It wasn't random, it wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, and in a strange way, it worked. The temple was destroyed, but his name survived. Even when authorities tried to erase it, the story spread. He became a symbol of something that still exists today. The idea that destruction can sometimes be a shortcut to recognition. But what lingers with me isn't just the act itself. It's what happened after. The temple was rebuilt, stronger, more magnificent, almost as if people believed they could correct what had been lost, restore meaning through effort and determination. For a while, it stood again, but not forever. Over time, its purpose faded, beliefs changed, empires shifted, it was attacked, stripped of its materials, and eventually dismantled. Its marble was taken, reused in other structures. Its identity slowly dissolved into the landscape. And I can't help but wonder, when something loses its meaning, does its physical form even matter anymore? Because it seems like once people stopped believing in it, preserving it stopped being important. The destruction didn't happen in one moment. It happened when people stopped caring. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus tells a slightly different story, but it leads to a similar place. This wasn't built for a god, it was built for memory. A ruler named Mausolus wanted something that would outlast him, something that would ensure he would never be forgotten. And in a way, he succeeded. The structure was so influential that his name became the word we still use today, mausoleum. That says something about how powerful it must have been. It combined architectural styles, rose to an impressive height, and was covered in sculptures that told stories of power and legacy. It wasn't just a tomb, it was a statement about permanence. And for centuries, it held that statement. It survived long after Mausolus himself was gone, long after the world around it began to change. But permanence, it turns out, has conditions. A series of earthquakes weakened the structure, breaking its columns, damaging its upper sections, and once again, the pattern repeats. What was once admired became material. Knights arriving in the region saw the ruins not as something to preserve, but as something to use. Stones were removed, transported, integrated into the construction of a nearby fortress. The mausoleum didn't just collapse, it was taken apart, piece by piece, until its original form no longer existed. And that idea keeps coming back to me. How easily meaning can shift. How quickly something can go from being untouchable to being just another resource. It makes me question the idea of legacy itself. If something built specifically to preserve memory can be dismantled and reused, then what exactly are we preserving when we try to be remembered? The statue of Zeus at Olympia feels like the most tragic of all, maybe because this time, people tried to save it. This wasn't just a monument. It was considered one of the greatest works of art ever created. Crafted from gold and ivory, built around a wooden frame, it wasn't just large. It was deeply detailed, almost lifelike. People didn't just see it, they felt something in its presence. There are stories that when visitors entered the temple, they were overwhelmed. Not just by the scale, but by the atmosphere, the sense that they were standing before something beyond human. And yet, even that wasn't enough to protect it. As the world changed and old beliefs lost their place, the statue was eventually removed from its original home. There was an effort to preserve it, to keep it safe in a new location, and for a moment, it seemed like this one might escape the pattern. But preservation isn't the same as protection. In the 5th century, a massive fire broke out in the building where the statue was kept, and that was the end of it. The wooden structure burned, the gold melted, the ivory disintegrated, everything that made it extraordinary vanished in a single event. And what stays with me isn't just the loss, it's the fact that even intention couldn't stop it. People tried to protect it, they moved it, cared for it, preserved it as best they could, and still, it disappeared, which forces me to face something I didn't expect when I started looking into all of this. It's not just neglect, or arrogance, or time that leads to the end of these wonders. Sometimes it's simply that they exist in a world where nothing is guaranteed, not even the things we value the most. And maybe that's the most difficult part to accept. That even when we recognize something as extraordinary, even when we try to hold on to it, that still might not be enough. And after seeing how each of these wonders met its end in a different way, I keep circling back to one final question that feels impossible to ignore. Why did one survive when all the others didn't? The Great Pyramid of Giza. It's easy to look at it and assume the answer is obvious. Of course it's still here. It's massive. It's ancient. It's one of the most iconic structures ever built. But the more I think about it, the less satisfying that explanation feels. Because the other wonders weren't small. They weren't insignificant. In their own time, they represented the absolute peak of human achievement. Just as impressive, just as meaningful, just as worthy of being remembered. And yet, they're gone. So what makes this one different? At first, I thought maybe it was luck. That somehow the pyramid just happened to avoid the disasters that destroyed everything else. No catastrophic fire, no deliberate dismantling, no series of earthquakes that reduced it to rubble. But that doesn't feel like the full answer. Because when I look closer, I start to notice something else, something less dramatic, but far more important. The pyramid doesn't depend on anything. There are no moving systems inside it that need to be maintained, no delicate materials that decay easily, no internal mechanisms that fail over time. It doesn't rely on belief, or function, or even relevance. It just exists. A structure made of millions of stone blocks, stacked with a kind of precision that still raises questions today. But at its core, it's simple, heavy, stable. And maybe that's the point. The other wonders, as extraordinary as they were, depended on conditions. The lighthouse needed to function, to be maintained, to serve a purpose. The gardens, if they were real, required constant water, constant care, constant effort just to stay alive. The statues relied on materials that could be melted, broken, repurposed. The temple depended on belief systems that could change. The mausoleum depended on the idea that memory itself needed a physical anchor. And once those conditions disappeared, so did they. But the pyramid didn't need any of that. It didn't need to be useful. It didn't need to be believed in. It didn't even need to be understood. And I think that's why it survived. Not because it was the most advanced, but because it was the most resistant. There's something almost uncomfortable about that realization, because it suggests that what lasts isn't always what's most meaningful or most beautiful. Sometimes it's just what's hardest to destroy. And that idea doesn't stay in the past. It follows me back into the present. Because when I look at the world we're building now, our cities, our technologies, our systems, I start to wonder how much of it is designed to last, and how much of it is designed to function, to impress, to evolve. We build things faster now, more complex, more interconnected, but also more dependent. Dependent on energy, on maintenance, on constant updates, on fragile networks that have to keep running without interruption. And suddenly, the pattern doesn't feel ancient anymore. It feels familiar. What happens when those systems fail? What happens when the conditions that support them change? Do they collapse all at once, or do they slowly fade piece by piece like everything that came before? I don't think the story of the ancient wonders is really about loss, at least not in the way I first thought. It's not just about things disappearing. It's about understanding why they couldn't stay. And maybe that's the part that changes how I see everything else. Because permanence isn't something we earn by building bigger or more impressive structures. It's something that depends on stability, simplicity, and independence from fragile conditions. And the more complex something becomes, the more ways it has to fail. So now, when I think about those lost wonders, I don't just imagine what they looked like. I think about what they reveal, about how even the greatest achievements can be undone, not because they weren't extraordinary, but because they were. Because they pushed limits, because they relied on systems that couldn't last forever. And maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe that's just the nature of creation itself. To build something incredible, knowing it might not survive, and still choosing to build it anyway. But there's one thought I can't seem to shake. If everything we consider permanent is only temporary on a long enough timeline, then the real question isn't what will last forever. It's what we're willing to lose, and whether thousands of years from now, anyone will look back at what we've built and wonder the same thing I'm wondering now. How did something so great just disappear? When I step back and look at everything we've uncovered, one idea becomes impossible to ignore. Nothing disappears for just one reason. The ancient wonders didn't vanish because they were weak. In fact, they were the opposite. They were extraordinary, ambitious, and far ahead of their time. But that's exactly what made them vulnerable. They depended on systems, beliefs, environments, and people that eventually changed or disappeared. Some were destroyed in moments, others faded slowly, and some may have only existed in the stories we chose to remember. What remains is not just a list of lost structures, but a pattern, a quiet reminder that greatness does not guarantee permanence. The deeper lesson here isn't about fear, it's about awareness. In our own lives, we build things too: careers, relationships, goals, even identities. And just like those ancient wonders, many of them rely on conditions we don't fully control. The real strength, then, isn't just in building something impressive, but in building something resilient, something that can adapt, endure change, and remain meaningful even when circumstances shift. Maybe that means simplifying what we rely on. Maybe it means focusing less on recognition and more on substance. Because in the end, what lasts isn't always what shines the brightest, but what can stand when everything else changes. So here's something I'd genuinely like to ask you. Which do you think matters more in the long run? Building something impressive or building something that can truly last? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share your answer down in the comments so others can see different perspectives too. And if you found this journey meaningful, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps support the channel and keeps more stories like this coming.